Okay, so welcome this afternoon to our childhood neurodiversity workshop on supporting your neurodivergent teenagers. I am Dr. Emmeline Guaspari. I'm a principal clinical psychologist, and I will let you introduce yourself.
I'm Dr. Lucy Hann, and I am also a clinical psychologist. And we both sit in the early intervention part of the children's and adolescents mental health team within NSFT in Suffolk.
Cool. So today's workshop is all about different experiences that any teenager might have, but with a focus on how these can be experienced by neurodivergent teenagers. So our hope is that this workshop will provide a space to think about these things and offer different ways to support you and your young person. So this workshop recognizes though that every family is different. Challenges for teenagers can feel totally overwhelming for some families, and it's okay if traditional advice hasn't worked for you. Well, it'd be nice if it had, but if it hasn't, don't panic. We're here to explore flexible strategies that align with your child's unique needs. So we want to, before we start, also give a bit of a special thanks to Participate. So members of Participate have very kindly given their time to share their lived experiences of their teenage years with neurodivergence. And we've used these throughout, either in direct quotes or in the information we're sharing today. So they've been very influential in helping shape this workshop this afternoon. And we're really mindful that this is a huge topic. And we've tried to sort of really mentalize and sort of gain feedback from carers and parents about what they might find most useful. But we recognize we can't cover everything, and therefore feedback on the topics covered would be really helpful. We'll ask you for that feedback right at the end of our workshop. So for those of you that can give that feedback, we really value it, and it really helps us shape some of our workshops. Okay, I'm going to start us off with a Slido to help us think about our adolescents and our teenagers. What aspects of adolescence or teenage years and neurodiversity do you find challenging as a parent or carer? So, what are the challenges we've got in this room today? I can think of many challenges. The meltdowns, absolutely. Accepting boundaries, yeah, really tough, isn't it? Anxiety, yeah, withdrawal, depression, regulating emotions, shutdowns. Yeah, so some people can implode, so go internal, and some go outwards. Managing meltdowns, school attendance, anxiety. Yeah, a lot of anxiety, isn't there? Eating, friendship difficulties, how to explain things in my children's language. Yeah. Challenging when my daughter won't get out of bed and get to school. Yeah. Refusal to follow instructions, chores and doing anything for themselves, managing time. Yeah, so there's a lot around mood, there's a lot around anxiety, social relationships, unwillingness to wash. Yeah, that battle getting them through that shower is horrendous sometimes, isn't it? Okay. Anxiety, some self-harm. Yeah. Having patience. Is that in your teenager or you, or possibly both? Okay. Comments from other people. I'm assuming that means from other people, so I'm making an assumption here. Protecting my own mental health. It can be really draining, can't it? Okay. I think we're getting a really good sense of some of the challenges in the room, and Lucy and I will definitely talk to some of those challenges this afternoon. And some of it may feel a little bit like doom and gloom, but we'll also talk about the benefits sometimes, which you might go, what benefits, Emmy? There aren't any, but let's see. Yeah, worry what other people think and see. Yeah, we're quite conscious, aren't we? What do people and how people judge us, and do they understand and do they know? Yeah, difficulty socializing, even with family, younger siblings to deal with that. Yeah. And sometimes we also might worry about our siblings kind of seeing how we manage things differently, maybe as well. Okay, let's move us on. So let's have a little think about what we'll talk about this afternoon. So teens face all sorts of challenges with changes in their brain and body and identity. So those will be some of the things we'll talk about. But neurodiverse teens can have an extra set of challenges. So for example, teens with ADHD might find that puberty aggravates some of their difficulties. For both autism and ADHD teens, the higher academic expectations in high school can be a strain on their executive functioning. Now, we'll talk a little bit about that in a little while and what that means. And a drive for independence sometimes triggers conflict or impulsivity at a time of going through transitional milestones like learning to drive, forming relationships with new or different friends, developing an identity, and engaging in new behaviors. So, for many families, the teen years can be a very bumpy ride. And I even remember that as a teen myself. So, we start the workshop looking at some of the challenges that might come up and then move into the second half, which Lucy will do, looking at some of those more practical strategies. And hopefully, we'll find some strategies that might help you a little bit today. And help you in your teen and that journey that you're kind of going through at the moment. So hopefully the challenges don't feel too overwhelming for some of you. Unfortunately, they probably do feel very overwhelming at this point. We'll talk about some of those difficulties in adolescence, but we'll also talk about the upside of some of that period. So that's what we're going to do. So the first part, very much about the challenges, the changes that kind of your teenagers going through, and then we'll look at the strategies. Okay, so running through this workshop, we're going to hold in mind a key idea that our aims when we're supporting our young person, and from feedback from those that with lived experiences and those that we've worked with, is that at the core, we want our young people to feel validated, understood, and contained. That's kind of often our main purpose. And we might feel none of those things ourselves right this minute, looking at the Slidos you've just sort of kind of answered the question to. So, adolescence is a period where young people often don't feel these things and report feeling quite misunderstood. So, often those battles are, I'm feeling misunderstood, you're not hearing me, and we have this argument to and fro potentially. And we know that this can sometimes be compounded when a young person is neurodivergent. So, it's particularly important for us to hold these things in mind today. So, whilst we give some general psychoeducation and strategies, we also want to recognize that every neurodivergent person is different, just like every neurotypical. We're all different. So, if we've met one person with neurodiversity, we've met one neurodivergent person. And this is really voiced as important by those who have helped us contribute to this workshop today. So, we really want to give that message today. We have a lovely quote to illustrate this from someone with lived experience reflecting on their teenage years, and I'll read it to you. So, just feeling seen and supported for who I really was would have made the hardest part easier to carry. So that's quite a powerful quote, and we just want to share some of these quotes throughout with you today. So, before we get to the content, we just want to take a moment to think back to our own adolescence. So I want you to really kind of have this moment to think about what was it like when you were an adolescent, a teenager, and think about some of the things you did, perhaps some of the difficulties you experienced yourself. Now, I appreciate this might be painful, so if you need a moment to step away because it becomes overwhelming to think about it, that's totally okay. Perhaps some of the challenges you pose to your own parents or carers. You may be neurodivergent yourself and be able to think back to your own experience of being a neurodivergent teenager. So just use a moment here to reflect on what it felt like to be that teen and perhaps what others' experience of you may have been through that period of time. I don't like thinking back to my own, I have to say. I was quite a difficult teen. So hopefully this will help us mentalize our teen a bit more as we move into thinking about some of the challenges that being a teen can pose for our young people. So I just really want you to start with that thinking and getting into that mindset of being a teenager for a minute. So a big part of teenage years are managing the changes going on in our brain and our body. So we're going to talk you through some of the main changes and things to be aware of, starting with understanding the teenage brain. It's worth just sort of letting you know that we do have another workshop in our mental health series around understanding the adolescent brain and supporting our teenagers with emotions that will tell you a little bit more about some of the brain changes than we're able to go into this afternoon because we've got an agenda ram-packed today, haven't we, Lucy? So this workshop will go into more detail than we do today, but we'll give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour today. So it's worth noting that some of the brain differences we see in neurodivergent people leads to heightened emotional emotional sensitivity already So that's what they're starting with. So combined with teenage years, where the brain is busy developing into that adult brain, and it can increase that emotionality if you want. So one person from our participation group stated, I think it's really important to reflect on how different the teenage years can feel, not just because of the usual changes and pressures, but because your brain works differently. And that can be both powerful and overwhelming. So we're really great, they're saying, but also a bit far too much, really. So, okay, so let's move us on a little bit to think about the brain. So, some of you may already be aware of the brain house. So, this is called the brain house, as we talk about it in quite a few of our workshops. So, for those of you that have heard some of this content, it might be a nice refresher at this point. For those of you that don't know about it, the brain house is described by an American psychiatrist called Dan Siegel. And here is illustrated by Dr. Hazel Harrison, who is a clinical psychologist. So the brain house describes an upstairs and a downstairs brain. So the upstairs brain is like our control tower. It's amazing. It's our prefrontal cortex. It's just behind our front here. So this is an amazing part which helps us with our higher level thinking. So the kind of things it does is planning, problem solving, organizing, flexibility of thinking. They're great things. So, but this is the slowest part of our brain to develop and doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s. So research suggests that for those with autism or ADHD, this process takes longer to develop than the typically developing peers. So you may have to accept that this takes a little bit longer for your young person. So those control tower functions of the brain are just going to take that bit longer, possibly. I can't give you a time frame, but the research just suggests it's a bit longer. So then we've got the downstairs part of the brain. Now this is our emotion center and keeps us safe as it activates what we call our fight, flight, or freeze response when we perceive a threat. So this part of our brain has been fully developed since we're born. So this is like our most established part of the brain, and it's our limbic system. That's the fancy word for it. So it includes kind of things like our hippocampus. I'll throw a few fancy words at you, but I'll tell you what they kind of do, which is sort of responsible for our memory, our hypothalamus, which regulates our autonomic nervous system. So that's things like blood pressure, heart rate, hunger, and things like that. And then our amygdala processes our emotions, particularly our fear and pleasure response. So, so if we're facing a real threat, we would want our brain and body to react without overthinking it. So we need to kind of just get into action, into a response. So that's where our emotion center is key, really. So we don't want to go, oh, that's a real threat. Let's have a little think about it. Is it looking really like a threat? Am I going to be okay? We just want to respond to it if it's a real threat. So research suggests that in autism, this part of the brain can be overactive, which may get in the way of effectively using those higher level executive functioning skills because it's the dominant part. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens when that's dominant. So when they're both working really well together and they're really well connected, they communicate, they talk to each other really effectively. However, when the downstairs part of the brain becomes so strong and overwhelmed, the two parts can disconnect. So you can see it on the second image to your right. It's a bit that top part of the house gets disconnected. And it's called flipping the lid. Now, some people might not like that term, but that's kind of the term used in the description. And it's driven by emotions. So neurodivergent children and teenagers might flip their lid more often than neurotypical young people, or find it harder to bring that thinking part of the brain back online when they do flip their lids. So it might take longer to kind of calm down to be able to kind of do that thinking part. So, and there's multiple reasons for that. So things that might contribute to that are sensory sensitivity, mind wandering, and understanding our own and others' emotions and things like that. So those complicating factors that come with being neurodivergent sometimes. So during adolescence, the downstairs part of the brain is linked to pleasure, excitement, and reward, and is a highly sensitive and easily activated by taking risks. And this is true for all adolescents. So these changes mean they're more likely to experience emotions more intensely. So you might have seen that shift as your young person's hit adolescence, so which starts from the age of 10 or in your teenage years, so your 13s. So you might have seen that real shift and they've become much more emotionally reactive and responding to things much more quickly. So this might lead to them being more impulsive and risk and taking more risky behaviors. So you might have some really incongruent experiences. So things that don't make sense to you really, because you can have some really sophisticated conversations about all sorts of things one minute, and then they do something that feels really irrational to you, and you have absolutely no idea why they've even done it or can't make sense of it because they seem really bright and clever, really, on the one hand. So this might be really difficult for you as a parent and can be conflicting with what you potentially see and hope for your young person. Because we all have hopes about what our young people will do as they kind of grow up and how we want them to be, because we have those hopes generally. So the upstairs and downstairs do different things, but in adolescence, the downstairs part of the brain can be more sensitive and more readily activated. And this can heighten and be prolonged for neurodivergent teens. So, for example, teens with ADHD might find they are unfairly labeled. And sometimes they get really horrible labels, like being called lazy or oppositional, when these neurological differences are largely invisible and misunderstood. So, some of our young teens, people don't know, people don't understand. So, so the research suggests that autistic brain changes may have a slightly altered trajectory, going through these changes, adding to that sense of feeling different to their peers at this time. So we'll talk a little bit more to that in a little while. So, of course, all these skills of the control tower part of the brain are also skills we use in academic work. So, exams might be a particularly stressful time for neurodivergent teens when they're having to utilize these control tower functions under immense stress and finding that a real challenge. So, if we're struggling to manage that emotion, you can see we can't really be very flexible. We can't plan our work very well. We can't organize our work very well. We can't problem solve very well. So this is a real challenge in exam times, and Lucy will talk a little bit more about what we might do about that later. So the stress might increase things like, and I guess one of the things that might happen if you've got a neurodivergent child who maybe stims or has tics, you might find that those kind of increase with excitement, but also with stress. So it might be really important for us to hold that in mind when we think about managing things like exam stress in our teen years. So we'll look at some of those strategies a little bit later today. So, okay, a little bit more on the brain, so please bear with me. But what we do in adolescent, we think about our brain as being under construction. Now, that's a bit of a funny term, I appreciate, but a lot of changes are happening neurologically. So you'll have to bear with me here a little bit. So while we have talked about some of the challenges that can occur, it's also time for opportunity. I told you I'd show you the silver lining of adolescence in a little while. So a time that's right for learning, refining, and developing skills. So this is generally true of adolescents. So they're therefore really good, potentially, not all, at learning new things at this point, like languages, sports, or musical talent, if they have the opportunity, is obviously the first requirement, but secondly, also the interest. Now, this is sometimes the challenge in our neurodivergent children because they can be very specific about their interests. So that's because the upstairs part of the brain undergoes some fine tuning. So the technical term for this are synaptic pruning and myelination. Wow, I've managed to say that second word. I struggle quite often. So fancy words, aren't they? But basically, this means you use it or you lose it. So at this point. So if an adolescent uses a skill repeatedly, the neural pathways will grow stronger and it naturally requires the opportunity and interest. Otherwise, those connections aren't built. So this is a time of increasing connectivity in the brain. So lots of kind of wiring going on there, isn't there? Which for our neurodivergent teens, that already have some very specific interests means it can be a time where they really hone these skills and enhance their learning around a subject or interest. I mean, they're so smart sometimes. In line with this increase of connectivity, the more opportunity an adolescent has to link the upstairs and the downstairs part of the brain that we've just talked about, the better. So if they increase the connectivity between the two parts, it can help them balance their thinking and emotion. Sounds so simple, but I know it's not. Okay, it's much harder as an adult, sorry to say adults, to have that level of flexibility. So adolescents are incredibly lucky as they have more opportunity around some of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about connectivity for a second. So myelin, a fatty sheath that surrounds neuron, helps transmit those signals quicker in adolescence. So quicker flow of information. So that's why young people can take on so much more information. Myelin continues to form throughout adolescence, with the frontal lobe being the last area, though. So remember that bit about flexibility, problem solving is the last area. So it's not all doom and gloom sometimes, even if it might feel like it. So we have to be mindful of the brain differences there are in adolescence. It may mean that they engage more in terms of emotions, risk taking, and thrill seeking behaviors compared to adults. So this is why we sometimes don't get it. Um, so they may respond more from the emotion part of the brain. So that might be the key driver at this point. So you might find that they get really emotional about things that seem really little to you as an adult, and you might not understand it. But hold in mind they're much more sensitive at the stage because remember, that's the part that's much more sensitive. So these changes happen for all teenagers and are challenging enough on the whole. But we also know neurodivergent brains process things differently in the first place. So this can mean it feels even harder to manage those changes as they might see their peers able to manage some of these changes more easily. For example, we know that the neurodivergent brain processes sensory information in different ways, and it can be much easier to become overwhelmed by sensory input. So the neurodivergent brain may not pick up on some of those non-verbal social cues as quickly, which can lead to difficulties. So there's also differences in attention, struggling to focus or focusing intensely, so being too intense. This isn't about laziness, it's not about lack of motivation necessarily, but rather how their brain processes tasks and stimuli. So on the flip side, the ability to hyper focus can be a major asset in tasks that require intense dedication or creativity. So okay, and Dr. Thomas Armstrong has a really interesting journal called The Myth of the Normal Brain, so which you can Google, and it speaks about some of these differences from a really different viewpoint. So it might be helpful to look at. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about the brain for a minute and move us on to physical changes that happen. Now, I'm not giving you an education session here, I promise, or I'll try not to. So, obviously, puberty is the word used to describe this physical and emotional change that happens in our teens who become adults. It happens at different times for different children. So, that's also be really helpful to remember. And you might remember from when you went through puberty yourself, some were going through it really early, and it might have been you, or you might have been quite late, and the kind of challenges that brings for you sometimes. So, it usually begins sometime between the age of 9 and 14. So, that's a great, massive time span, isn't it? And it's not a quick process, and it usually takes around 4 years for the physical changes to complete, and the emotional changes take even longer than that. So, for neurodivergent young people, it can be a change that they find really difficult to accept, or maybe not. They might have been really well prepared, very concrete about it, but they may not. So, they might find it really difficult. So, remember, we're all different. So, the lack of control over their emotions and physical changes can, for some, be upsetting. So it can be helpful to normalize it by talking about the changes from as young an age as possible. So for those of you in the room with younger children, that might be really helpful to hold in mind already to prep them for that change. Um, you'll know how to approach the topic and the discussions around it best based on your child's preferred communication style. And, so you know your child best like this. So it's about helping them feel knowledgeable about the changes to come or that are already happening can be key in supporting them feel able to manage these. Now, my experience is that in my children's school, they did a lot of education around this. So it's a really good opportunity when they come home and tell you about it to have those conversations as well. So it's also important to acknowledge that puberty can be especially difficult for young people with gender diversity. So we'll think about identity in a little while, and knowing and understanding your gender identity is a key part of adolescence. So we do a lot of questioning about ourselves, which we'll talk about a little bit more. If a young person feels distress related to their gender, then puberty can be really difficult time potentially. So it's in itself a topic that requires a lot of time, care, and consideration. So we don't have enough time to talk about this in a huge amount of detail today. But research indicates that neurodivergent teens, particularly those who are autistic, are more likely to identify as transgender or gender diverse. That's not to say all of them do. So this is just what the research suggests. If this is something that you are experiencing at the moment, there's a lot of resources out there to support you and your teen. So let's come back to a slide. I feel like I've done a lot of talking. Be nice to hear back from you. So what do you think of when you consider the social impact of teenage years? Because we're going to move on to thinking about the social impact next. So it might be that you want to think about identity changes that happen in those teen years. So just have a think about, what do you think of when you consider those social impacts? Trying to fit in, absolutely. Huge, isn't it? I've had so many conversations with young people where they're so desperately needing to fit in and be like others. So struggle to communicate and keep up with peers, peer pressure, fitting in, needing to belong, wanting to fit in, but also stand out. Yeah, that kind of conflict, isn't there? Being considered weird, I think I just saw literally as it passed my screen. Social media can be a challenge. Finding self-identity, not feeling their friends understand them. Yeah, finding your tribe, feeling awkward and shy, maybe. Yeah. Change of friendships, no longer fitting in. Oh, and those fleeting friendships kind of keep changing sometimes, don't they? Isolating, yes, so maybe retreating as well. So that might be a bit of a challenge. Making and keeping friends, it's a challenge. And I think that is a challenge for most teenagers. Acceptance of self, yet caring what you look like. Absolutely. Mimicking to fit in. Yeah, some really interesting reflections here. Masking to attempt to fit in as so many pressures. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about masking in a little while. So figuring out who we are. Yep. Oh, it's so tough. Such a tough time. Be more or less advanced. Yeah. So, and I guess puberty wise as well as emotionally, possibly. Social media. Yeah. Okay. I will move us on if that's okay. And I appreciate somebody was still typing, so we will see that later. Okay, Erickson's theory of identity development, tongue back in again, Lucy, reflects that in the adolescent years, it's all about discovering who we are. That's such a key thing, isn't it? And that challenge of, I'm a child, I'm not really a child, but I'm not an adult, I'm not quite there, and working out who we are is such a challenge. So when our teens are able to experiment with different identities, exploring what their interests are, their values, their goals, and they might change those quite fleetingly as well sometimes, and receive support and guidance without pressure, they can develop a strong sense of who they are. That is probably easier said than done sometimes. However, it's a time where we can easily become overwhelmed and confused about who we are and what our role is too. Now, I think that's probably true for our adolescents and our teenagers, but also sometimes for us when we face those changes. So not only are our young people managing that biophysiological change in their teenage years, but they're also navigating the new social considerations that come with this age. Who am I? Where do I fit in? So lots of those reflections that you've just given me on Slido. The focus in adolescence also becomes connection. So we've again just talked a bit about that. So our adolescent brain craves connection, a sense of belonging, fitting in. So neurodivergent teens, while wired differently, are still a teenager and will still be going through this identity development stage. So we can't shield them from it. They still go through it. However, a challenge that our teens can face at this time can be that sense that neurodivergent young people often talk about feeling different. That's one of them. And I think somebody put that on the slide a minute ago. And this may be more of a struggle for a neurodivergent teen whilst they're in that sort of pull to connect, but a sense of difference perhaps becoming bigger. So, and somebody talked a bit about that masking, so they can try and fit in. So, this sense of peer rejection might also, therefore, be experienced intensely. Remember, with that emotion that feels so much bigger as well, as it conflicts what our brain is wired and to have at this time. So, a big part of those teenage years is about trying to connect. So, it's also a time where, as parents, we're learning a new role as our teen is finding sort of developing that sort of sense of self. So, they're trying to find themselves, but we're going through this change as well, aren't we? So we often hear that parents with neurodivergent children spend a lot of time and energy on protecting and advocating for their child, because this is what we've often had to do throughout the years. Therefore, managing a change in our role as parents um, is sort of, when our adolescents drawn to more independence and allowing them to explore their identity independently may feel like a real conflict because we're used to kind of having to protect them and to kind of advocate for them and really think ahead for them. And so this is kind of quite a conflict sometimes we find as a parent. So you can see on this slide that we've got open at the minute that there's so many different ways in which our teens are beginning to explore their new identity and the influence that they may be exposed to that will play part of shaping this for them. So you can see lots of different things on here. So, social identity in the current age also has the added pressure now for young people from social media, where often there's a sense that social media almost tells you who you should be, which may be more difficult to navigate if you are already feeling self-conscious about your identity or easily influenced by what others are posting and feel a pressure for this to be relevant to yourself. So, if we think about that ourselves, how often do we maybe look at social media and go, oh, so and so has this beautiful life? But actually, we only choose to put certain things on there. But in the teen years, we kind of think this is how it should be. So one of our young people with lived experience said the following, and I'll read it to you. I remember feeling things so deeply that not always knowing how to express it or manage the overwhelm, and that would often come out in ways people misunderstood. Friendships were confusing. I wanted connection, but didn't always know how to navigate social rules or know who was safe to trust. This really highlights that whilst our neurodiverse teens may experience difficulties in navigating social connection, does not mean it's not desired. So I guess this is worth holding in mind. So what are the dilemmas for them? And it might be that you also have to guide them through some of those social interactions. So, your teen might have their first relationship. They might be on a FaceTime or WhatsApp call or whatever kind of other kind of versions there are at this point. And you might have to try and help them to kind of ask questions because they don't think to ask those questions. Certainly, I've done that with my adolescent recently. So, where you have to try and help them do that connection, that socializing a little bit. So, we do have a workshop on social relationships within our neurodiversity series, and this might be helpful for those who do have some more specific social relationship challenges at this point. And we'll share the link of that workshop at the end of this one. So we've made the slide a bit full, a bit messy, because it's a good reflection of how overwhelming this can all feel for our teens. We probably could have made it even more messy to really hit the reality, in fairness. But the other complicating factor that we know can also impact for neurodivergent teens is masking. So somebody mentioned masking in that last Slido, which we'll move on to very shortly. But I'll do a Slido before I do. Okay, do you feel the need to protect your child as they enter adolescence and why? So I guess we wanted to just sort of get a sense here of how parents are feeling entering teen years. And some of you are already in the throes of teen years and maybe on the end of teen years, maybe even. So that balance between protection and encouraging independence. And we just want to get a bit of a sense. Absolutely, because they're so vulnerable. Yes. Yes, because people are so cruel. Yes, worry they can't, yeah, themselves. Yeah. They're struggling so much. So, sorry, I've managed to just lock myself out. Yes, social media to help protect mental health. Yeah. New circumstances following marriage breakup. Okay. I'm sorry to hear that. It's hard to see her struggling and knowing how to help, but her not letting us in. Oh, it's so tricky, isn't it? They're vulnerable, want to kind of, yeah, want to be the safe haven for them. Um, yeah, and oblivious to risk, yes. Don't trust their surroundings, feel with social media they don't understand the real world. They don't understand the social world around them, delayed social development, creating a bigger divide. So, yeah. So, social media is an interesting one, I think, because it can also be a great place to connect, depending what you do on it, I suppose. Sometimes it's vulnerable behind in development. Teen years are an unknown. There's real concern of which way a teen will go. Absolutely. So much worry, yeah, anxiety, drugs, the wrong company. I mean, we all worry whether our child is neurodivergent or not. I think about those things, but actually, our neurodivergent children, we often can feel they're much more vulnerable, which we will talk to a little bit. Easy to exploit, yeah. Minor children in care, so life's already been so tough. Oh, yeah. They want to protect from self-harm. Yeah. So I think there's a real sense about actually feeling they're so vulnerable, worrying about the real world and sort of social media can be very demanding and overwhelming from school and home dynamics for them. And mine often seem to get more tired and want to escape, sometimes share, but sometimes, yeah, hard to get them to go and grow. Yeah, it's a really, really difficult time, isn't it? Okay, so one of you has talked about masking already, and we've t touched on it again then a little bit. So we've just spent some time recognizing the challenge in adolescence of navigating that sense of self, developing identity. And we think it's important in this conversation to recognize the impact on masking within the context of the crucial time of trying to establish our identity and wanting to connect with others. So, as adolescents may increase that sense of desiring connection, neurodivergent teens may find themselves more likely to engage in masking to try and conform to social norms and their neurotypical peers. So it's that kind of, that desire we talked about that happens in those teenage years of needing to connect, that sense of we want to. We know that masking is exhausting for neurodivergent individuals. Not only is it exhausting, but can also have a big impact on various parts of a person's life and can create challenges in feeling a real sense of having their own identity. So we often hear from families where the young person feels like they mask a lot during the day when they're at school. So we often hear that. So schools often say, "Oh, there's no problem." Um, and then when they kind of get home, they're often exhausted, overwhelmed, and those emotions are more likely to spill out because the mask comes off at that point, and they no longer have to keep it all in and feel the need to act in a certain way. So often we get that real kind of challenge and that tug, and and I guess we're left often holding those pieces at home. We just want to highlight here that it's important to remember that whilst masking is common, it's not a universal experience. It can vary intensely and can be conscious and unconscious. So it's important to be mindful of masking, but not make those assumptions. So be curious with your young person about whether this is something that they sort of find difficult or is relevant to them. So the slide gives a few challenges that can come when young people feel they need to mask a lot. That loss of self. So it can make it difficult to know one's true preferences, interests, and values, as individuals can focus on appearing neurotypical or kind of to adopt those kind of qualities of others around them, rather than being authentic in their own interests and preferences. And I have seen this with many teenagers, whether they are neurodivergent or not. This is a huge thing, really, where they go, I have to pretend I like something like, I don't know, certain films when actually they don't like them at all. And they will watch them to pretend, if that makes sense. So it's about that kind of loss of kind of identity potentially. This is just an example. Mental health challenges, a constant effort of masking can be exhausting and contribute to anxiety, low mood, and burnout sometimes. So, so it can be really exhausting and have a massive impact. Identity confusion. So teen years is a time of developing your identity, working out who you are, what your role is in different systems. So that's school, home, and what other kind of places they might go to, because they might have kind of hobbies and groups they attend. So if your young person's putting on a mask, if you want to call it, for a minute, of who they are, it can be really difficult to develop that sense of identity. So because they might be pushing that down and pretending they don't have that interest or that value, that they really, really value themselves. Feeling of not belonging. So individuals who mask may feel less connected and can create a sense of feeling quite isolated or disconnected. Somebody talked about being more isolated and withdrawn. All of these factors can come together to create a sense of burnout. This refers to an extreme exhaustion and mental health decline resulting from that ongoing suppression of our behaviours to fit in with neurotypical social norms. That's a fancy word, isn't it? Fancy term. So that effort to kind of mask can leave them feeling really quite exhausted and worn out, really. So symptoms of this might be things like struggling with self-care, reduced engagement in activities and social interactions, decline in executive functioning. So remember that problem solving, planning, all of those sort of things, and memory. So when we talk about strategies later, we'll think about how we can manage and avoid burnout. So, okay, I'm going to try and move us on a little bit quicker because I know I've got lots to get through still before Lucy takes over. So I really want you to kind of engage in a bit of an activity here. So I want you to think about three integral parts of yourself, maybe your favorite thing to do. And I appreciate that might be hard when you kind of maybe very family driven, depends on who you are. Maybe some of your favorite people you surround yourself with, maybe favorite family members and those kind of things. I want you to think about three things that are really key about who you are as a person. So, and then I want you to ask yourself three questions. But I want you to keep those answers in your head and not give me the answers to them. So I don't want you to kind of tell me about those three integral parts. And I know you can't literally tell me this is like very hypothetical in your heads at home, of course. So what I want you to do is answer those questions in your head without giving the answers to the three questions. Tell me a bit about yourself. What are you doing this weekend? Who do you like to spend time with? So it's really hard, isn't it? So often what people say when we do this, that it's felt like a really false conversation because you're not able to tell them those integral things about yourself. So the only way to engage at this point is to try hard to avoid the topics or to lie, basically. You could make it up, I suppose. This can feel really exhausting and isolating. So really hard if you can't talk about those cool things about yourself. But also recognize that we all do this to some degree in some situations. So it depends where you are. If you're at work, you might not share some of those things about yourself, or, your teen might be at school or at college. They might not tell people everything. So we all do it to some degree. But of course, this activity does not get across exactly how a neurodivergent person's masking would feel, but it might help to really mentalize how difficult and isolating masking can be for a child who is doing this a lot in certain or all contexts. So just think about how much effort you would have had to have put in not to answer with those core things about yourself, possibly. This is our only way we can think about how to demonstrate masking to you as best as we can think to do. So I'm going to talk about vulnerabilities, and a lot of you have already touched on these in your Slido, so I might be able to talk about them a little bit faster if that's okay. So at the time when our identity is developing, there is often a drive for connection, but perhaps lots of barriers to actually feeling connected with peers. It can be a time where it's maybe important to be aware of some of those vulnerabilities. So we want to recognize that vulnerabilities are relevant for all teens. So they're all vulnerable, but through feedback and co-production discussions, it's been reflected that they're particularly important to think about for our neurodivergent teens who might have a different understanding of the world and others and perhaps be less risk aware or more impulsive. So here we'll touch on those vulnerabilities and then later in the workshop explore some of those strategies. So some of those might be county lines, struggling with social cues, peer pressures, communication, make it harder for neurodivergent teens to recognise manipulative behaviour. Sorry to use that term, but That's often what happens when people recruit into county lines. Or to say no when they feel really pressured. So neurodivergent teens might find it especially challenging to fit in. They might be more susceptible to gangs or exploiters offering friendship, attention, and that sense of belonging. Another vulnerability could be about impulsivity related to risk-taking behavior. So during teen years, young people often have access to things or more independence. And it might be that when impulsive behaviors might create challenges for young people. So it might be that it's harder to kind of consider future risks of their actions, might increase risky reward-seeking behaviors. So um, I will so that's obviously much more difficult. So if you're kind of that way inclined, it's harder to see the consequences of some things. It might be that actually managing money might be more difficult. So they might have their own money, they might have their own PIP, all of those things that go straight into their account. And so they might have access to money without kind of your controls over that. So this combined with, say, things like impulsivity or lack of awareness of risk can make it more difficult to manage. So we'll highlight some resources around that at the end. Keeping safe in public. So difficulties in social communication, understanding boundaries may lead to some more challenges. So this is why you're all really worried. I'm really worried for my teen neurodivergent sort of adolescent. So we kind of worry about these things because it makes them really vulnerable. Because sometimes our children don't see the danger. So, okay. So I'm going to move us on to increased responsibility. I'm sort of mindful of time, Lucy. I'm trying desperately hard. So as your child moves into adolescence, there's a big jump of responsibility placed on them. So things like expectations to be able to remember more, do more. For our young people, it can be really overwhelming, especially overwhelming for our neurodivergent teens. So in our parent workshop on planning, organising and remembering, we talk lots about some of these things. So that might be another good workshop to check out if you haven't already checked it out. So it might also give you some ideas on how to support them to manage some of those challenges. So example of someone from Participate expertise on this topic, I also found independence really tough, especially things like keeping routines, managing time, or coping with sudden changes, which sometimes made me feel behind everyone else. I think this really highlights that every young person's independence will look different. That doesn't mean someone is better or worse at being independent. It just means it's really important to have open conversations about what feels manageable and what doesn't. So transitions obviously can be really difficult. You're kind of moving from primary school to high school, or maybe from education into the workplace. So, and that comes with different expectations on our young people to kind of manage different cognitive and social demands. And the demands on those kind of things massively increases. So it's kind of how do we help our young people manage some of those changes in responsibility and those changes in expectations placed on them. Okay, so you'll be pleased to know I have told you as much as I can think to do in this time span, and I will try and pass you over to Lucy. And I'm sorry I've left you slightly less time than I hoped, Lucy. Hopefully we'll manage.
Thanks, Emmy. There's lots to cover, and it is, a super broad topic. So we will welcome any feedback. So we're now going to move on to thinking about strategies. Because there is so much to cover, I'm also just going to do a bit of signposting here to other resources that we have, because we haven't got time to kind of cover all of what we would want to cover. And when we were talking to people with lived experience, the kind of things that came up that it might be helpful to have kind of strategies and support around were relationships, anxiety, low mood, that kind of organising and kind of exam prep and things like that. And we have workshops on all of them already. So when you get the slides sent round, these are kind of links to the slides. So you'll just be able to click on them and it will send you to the workshops that we've already done in these areas. So I just wanted to flag before going into the rest of our strategies that there's loads of other resources there that might be really helpful for you. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so we started the workshop thinking about how we want to make our teens feel validated, understood and contained. So how do we do this when they're developing their identity, they're feeling unsure of who they are? We've recognised that social impact is huge. So what can we do to support our teens? So as kind of parents and carers, how you respond to and support your child at this time can greatly influence their development of their identity. You can nurture your child's identity by providing kind of emotional support, encouraging that independence, supporting them to explore and to take some risks, maintaining open communication, modeling acceptance, that kind of how they want to develop their identity is accepted by you, respecting their diversity, but also setting those boundaries and kind of discussing some of those society influences like we talked about in terms of thinking about how we keep our young people safe when they might have a different understanding of the world. But I just want to flag here that kind of recognizing and celebrating their small steps to discovering who they are is so essential. So this might not be focusing on traditional milestones. It might be really thinking about what it means for that young person. And that quote that we heard before about responsibility and getting to that at different times, I think really spoke to that in terms of just taking it at your young person's pace as they're developing their sense of identity. Parents and carers have such a huge role in this kind of ongoing journey in terms of supporting your young person. And I guess ways that you can do that can be kind of practicing active listening, pay attention to what they're actually saying rather than what we sometimes think our children are saying to us, refraining from offering judgments on kind of who they want to be and kind of what they're doing, being really patient. It'll often take time. And being aware of some of those nonverbal cues as well. Kind of we'll know our children well and we'll be able to pick up on those things that might highlight that there's something different going on that's maybe not being said. So let's get on to some practical strategies. So communication strategies. So before we get into any of our other practical strategies, we wanted to start with communication strategies. We can communicate well with our teens. We're going to be able to kind of help implement some of these other strategies we're going to get to. So these might be helpful to hold in mind kind of in all of the strategies that we think about. So these 6 communication strategies, they come from something called interpersonal psychotherapy. So whilst this therapy isn't specifically for neurodiverse adolescents, what we've done is we've taken the skills and we thought about how we can adapt them to make them be helpful for kind of working with our neurodivergent teens. They're skills that we can use when we're talking to our child, but also skills that we can teach to our child. So they're skills that we can we can use in both ways. We can think about how we use them when we're communicating to get what we want out of our adolescents, but we can also teach them as really concrete skills to our adolescents so that they can use them when they're trying to get what they want as well. Okay, so strike when the iron is cold. What do we mean? Avoid having those tricky conversations when people are in that reactive state. So whether that's you feeling in that kind of emotional state, whether you're in that kind of bottom part of your brain where the emotions are driving everything, or your young person is in that state where the emotions are driving everything, it's much, much better for both of you to step away and take some time to calm down. If you're both angry, likelihood is we're just going to both end up saying things that we regret in that situation. So it might mean you kind of having to name that and say, right, I'm going to give us both some time to talk, calm down, and arrange a different time to talk to your young person. And you'll know them best. So it might be that actually that conversation has to go on pause till tomorrow or even to the weekend when they're not so overloaded with school. But just thinking about finding a time that you can have those conversations where you really talk about what's happened and you can address difficulties, but where that upstairs brain is also online and they're not just being driven by those emotions. Because when our emotions are heightened, that kind of executive functioning is offline, and that's the bit that's going to help us kind of make changes, think reasonably, think rationally. So we want that online when we're having those conversations. Okay, and also meet those basic needs before you try and have those conversations. So it might be that they need a drink, they need some food. What we often find is that our young people are so exhausted from the day that actually they kind of need to actually stock up and replenish, I suppose, those meet those basic needs. So they might need some downtime when they come back from school. They might need a snack. They might need to have a glass of water before you go into any of those conversations. Okay, I statements. So this is about saying how you feel. So it might be, for example, Daisy, I feel sad when, or you, instead of saying kind of like you were really rude to me, saying I feel that you were being rude. So trying to make it I statements rather than you statements. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So you're more likely to provoke further arguments if you're talking about what they're doing, but if we talk about how we're feeling and statements about that's much more difficult for them to kind of argue with, because it's about our experiences. Okay, so, and also thinking about our neurodiverse teens, they might often find it more difficult to understand what we're kind of thinking, or what our experience is. So really naming that can be really helpful. So labeling your feelings, telling them this is what my experiences is, and this is how I'm feeling, can help them to understand and learn what your experience is too. Be specific. So when we're in that heightened state of emotions, we're much more likely to not make good sense. So it can be really helpful to be really specific about what the difficulty is, and really naming that. What is the problem? And then that leaves far less room for confusion. And if you're thinking about how to kind of approach a situation differently, it might be helpful to have a few solutions in mind yourself. So it might be that you kind of come up with 3 or 4 compromises of how you could both move forward in the situation. How many solutions you want to come up with might be really individual to your child. It might be that presenting 4 different ways that you could kind of problem solve together is far too overwhelming. But coming up with 1 or 2 ways might be really helpful to kind of lay your cards on the table. This is one way we could work towards doing this, or this is another way. What would you say would be a way for us to move forward? So just helping to kind of provide choice for them gives them that sense of agency, and gives them that sense of being able to have some responsibility within it, but also helps reduce the cognitive load. They're not having to come up with all that problem solving themselves when they're already in that emotional state. Okay, put yourself in their shoes. Be curious about why they're behaving the way they're behaving. What might they be feeling underneath that expression? They might need some scaffolding to try and understand what they're feeling. You know the things that your young person can find challenging. And it might be that you need to check in. Like, is what you're seeing right here something because something's gone on in their day? Has something triggered them? Are there kind of sensory things going on for them? Do you know that they've had difficult social situations and actually they're just feeling exhausted because they've had to mask all day? So put yourself in their shoes before you try and understand why they're behaving in the way they are. And don't give up. We know how hard this can be. And sometimes our empathy can be completely switched off when we're getting nothing in return. But when this happens, it's really important to hold in mind that your teen is probably struggling too. And sometimes understanding and thinking about what they're struggling with can kind of renew our source of empathy. And sometimes not. Sometimes we might not need to kind of access our own support or find empathetic friends who can support us to get back to that place of feeling empathetic towards our teen. Okay, moving on to thinking about special interests. So continuing with that theme of kind of helping your teen to feel understood and validated, nourishing special interests is really important when we think about how we holistically kind of support your child, how you champion their strengths, and how you support that kind of identity development. So parents and carers can play such a crucial role in encouraging their neurodivergent child to pursue hobbies and interests that excite them. I mean, I think quite typically we think with autism about kind of special interests, but this is totally applicable for teens with ADHD as well, or other neurodivergence. So what passions do they have? And how can we support them in pursuing those passions? And what are they interested in? That's the most important thing to think about, because we don't want to be trying to mold them into activities or areas that they just don't have any interest in, because actually that might make them feel more confused about their identity, or they might end up feeling like a bit of a sense of failure if they're not able to do that thing that they're not interested in. But what we do know is that encouraging their interests and accepting and celebrating their new unique strengths really supports them establish that identity, that sense of identity. It might also be that you think about with your teen how they can share that interest. How do you help them to share their special interests with their friends? Is there a way that they can connect with others through their special interests? There's lots of kind of groups we know of where you can connect over gaming or connect over football. There's lots of different topics where there's groups where teens can meet up and you talked about finding their tribe in that Slido. And that could be one way we can support that kind of social communication and like those friendships, is finding the people that have similar interests to them. Okay, a really nice statement that we got from our participate group was, being an adult doesn't mean giving up childish interests either. You don't have to stop liking Lego when you grow up. but you do need to know how to budget for trips to Legoland and how to get a hotel and train, and how to wear deodorant at Lego conventions. And I just thought this was a really lovely example of like, if we can support and nourish those special interests and how they develop as they grow up. So how their special interests might look when they're 7 or 8 might look quite different to when they're 17 or 18, but it could still be the same interest. And we can just think about how can we age appropriately support that special interest. Okay. So moving on to thinking about managing exam stress. So at the beginning of the workshop, we discussed the brain changes that happen in teenage years and the differences that might be going on for kind of our neurodivergent teens. So big difference for teenagers is going to high school, the increased academic pressures, and as part of that kind of managing exam stress, there's so much pressure sometimes put on the GCSE years and then on kind of A levels if they go to A levels. So yeah, there's a lot of pressure put on kind of exams, and that might be really tricky for your kind of neurodivergent teen. So it's really helpful to think about how we support them through this time. So what we thought when we looked at the brain differences, we recognized that actually that executive functioning part of your brain, the part of your brain that makes planning, that kind of all of those kind of skills around kind of managing our time and things like that can be a little bit difficult for some of our teens. So we want to think about what are the things that they struggle with and how can we use their unique needs and their unique strengths to support them in this time. So in terms of kind of preparing for exams, you also want to think about their overall well-being. So thinking about establishing healthy habits around this time. So thinking about their sleep, their nutrition, all of those kind of basic needs. It might be even more important to think about them at this time. And focusing on their individual progress. So how can we support them with their stress management in this time? You might need to build in kind of extra supports. So it might be kind of helping build in relaxation exercises into their routine, seeking reasonable adjustments, so having conversations with school about what they actually need in that exam to support them, and think about who else is supporting them at this time as well. So there's some really helpful guides that I've put links on the slides there. So there's a guide there from NAS, the National Autistic Society, and there's also in this ADHD Teenagers Guide, there's a really helpful bit on exams about what practical things do we need to be doing to support our teens when they're coming up to exams. And both of those kind of guides you could work through with your young person. But it's not just thinking about the exam, it's also thinking about planning revision and then thinking about after the exam. Often, particularly for our teenagers finishing their GCSEs, they then have a really long summer without the normal routine that they're used to. And that can be really challenging too. So thinking about before the exam, prioritizing kind of how they plan, how they do their revision, keeping breaks in their revision, changing up the topic if that's what they need, asking early about the adjustments they might need, letting other people know how they're feeling about these exams. But then also in the exam, go in with a plan. Think about how they might tackle some of these questions. They might need to use mocks to kind of trial out some of their plans. They might need to think about what sensory experience is the exam going to give me? And do I need to wear lots of layers so I can kind of manage how warm or cool I'm feeling? Do I need to think about the noises that might be in there? What are the sensory experiences of that exam and how can I plan for that? And they might need kind of internal kind of encouragement throughout that. So they might have a little phrase that they say to themselves that reminds them that they're kind of doing everything within their control and everything that they can within their circumstances. It's often really helpful for young people to have time afterwards to kind of decompress and to rest. They might need to kind of get out what happened in the exam by kind of writing it all down so they can kind of mentally park it. Or they might want to do something really active to kind of get some of those stress hormones out that are built up during the exam. But then it's also helpful to think about, so now what? So I've done the exam, now what's happening? Is my routine really changed? Do I need to think about that? If I've got another exam coming up, do I need some downtime before I then go on to do the revision for that? So just some real planning around all those different stages. And as I say, those links are really helpful when thinking about what else is available to support our teens. After we looked at the brain changes, we looked at some of the kind of physical changes that happen in our teenagers. So we're just going to take a minute to think about how we might manage puberty. And I guess our number one strategy here is talk about it, have those conversations as early as possible, be really explicit about some of the changes that might happen, so that your teen can prepare. And when you give that information, it might be really helpful to have it in different ways. So you will know what's most helpful for your child, but there's loads of kind of videos out there. There's books that can be really helpful. It might be that you have to kind of create a bit of a social story about what might change, or using pictures or visual strategies. So there's lots of different ways that you can help support their understanding of this time, especially when we know change is coming for them, and thinking about how we can help them prepare for this. There's lots of apps that might be helpful. Yeah, so there's lots of different ways. So I guess it's just being really explicit about preparing your child for puberty, helping them to understand what's going on, because it can be a time where they feel really scared about some of the changes that are going on in their body. And that reassurance by knowing what to expect or understanding what's already happened can be really helpful. We've just specifically got a thing here about preparing for a period. So we know that this often comes up a lot, particularly with our schools, around how we support neurodivergent female teens. So this is kind of some of the stuff that we often talk to schools about, because I guess it can be challenging on so many levels. There's the sensory aspects of them, kind of in terms of physical pain, bleeding, but then there's also the kind of planning around it. So having to make sure they've got kind of sanitary products on them, and understanding what it means for this change to be happening in your body and to be happening once a month. It can be a really physical and all-encompassing experience, which might feel really overwhelming on lots of different levels. So I guess it's just reinforcing that message that it's really important to be kind of preparing them for this change, really important to be having those conversations, and thinking about what might be most helpful for them at this time. So we've got a few little pointers in terms of what might be helpful. So it might be showing them kind of the menstrual products before they need to use them, thinking really kind of concretely with them about when to use products, and just getting a bit of a plan together about things. We can take I'm just trying to make sure I'm as quick as possible, so I'm just scanning through all the things that we've got. But yeah, I think the key message here is around that conversation. It might be really helpful. There's lots of apps nowadays that can help you plan, to know when they might be coming, when to expect them, and that can be really helpful for teens. Things like period pants, rather than kind of having to use change other sanitary products, has also been recommended as being helpful. And I guess just being really explicit with school about the things that are really helpful as well, because they might be a big kind of consideration in who supports your young person to navigate that each month. Okay, we talked about masking before, and kind of some of the impacts of that, and the kind of the negative implications of kind of feeling like you have to mask a lot. So we're just going to think here about what we can do to support our young people that are masking. So increased awareness. So if we can understand the impact of masking, then we're going to be able to kind of create more inclusive and more supportive environments. So this might be about having conversations with school and thinking about how can school be more accepting? How can school support neuroaffirmative environments so that our young person doesn't feel the need to mask as much as they are? It might be that we need to have those conversations actually within our families and within our wider families. What can we do to support environments where your young person doesn't feel the need to be masking as much as they do? And talking to your young person, understanding what things it is that they feel that they're having to mask and why they feel they're having to do that. Got a really helpful quote from someone from the Participate team. And they just said, it would be most helpful if adults at school didn't try to fix things about my personality and lifestyle that I didn't feel were broken at the time. I still have those traits and I still don't see myself as broken. So I guess there's just that awareness there that person feels like if the people at school had understood them for who they were and what they were doing, they wouldn't have felt that wouldn't have been such a challenging time for them. So thinking about where are the areas in which we can kind of increase the awareness and acceptance of neurodiversity, where our young people are spending time and feeling like they might have to mask. And then thinking about empowerment. So we want to kind of be empowering our young people and our neurodivergent teens to feel like they are supported and that their identity and their sense of who they are is really important. So really digging into their strengths and placing a bigger emphasis on those strengths. Nourishing those special interests, as we've spoken about before, can be so powerful. Really spend time with them thinking about what are their unique strengths and how does that serve them? What makes them a great individual? The teen years can be a real time of developing creativity or finding unique skills and interests. So recognizing those unique skills and interests, working out how they are developing this creativity, and that their different perspective actually brings a lot to the table and is really to be valued, is really important. And them feeling that themselves is really important in them feeling empowered. Celebrating how their different drivers and what motivates them is actually really important and actually supports their success. So really helping them to see those special, unique strengths that they have. And then we talked before about how masking can sometimes lead to burnout. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But often the symptoms of burnout can sometimes look like low mood. When Emmy was describing it earlier, I was really thinking, oh yeah, this can just look just like low mood when you're kind of having that social withdrawal, that struggling to get out of bed. It can lead to looking like low mood, when actually it's slightly different. So how you might support it would have a different approach. And we're going to move on to that in just a minute. I've just got some quotes before we move on to our strategy for burnout. So these are just some quotes that we wanted to share from those with lived experience about masking. So I think having a trusted adult who listened without judgment, explained things clearly, and believed in my strengths would have made such a difference. I needed more emotional support, not just discipline or advice. Spaces where I could be myself without masking and where I didn't feel like the difficult one would have helped me feel less alone. And I just think that so speaks to those kind of the empowerment aspect. So where they could be themselves, where they believed in their strengths, that talks to that empowerment that we just spoke about, and that increasing that awareness as well. So if they had a trusted adult who had listened without judgment, who explained things clearly, we can support those around our young person to listen without judgment and to explain things in a way that our young person will understand. Looking back, I wish there had been more support in helping me understand my brain, more freedom to be myself without masking, and more adults who celebrated my differences instead of trying to fix them. So again, just talks to that idea of kind of really recognizing their strengths and empowering them, rather than supporting those kind of neuroaffirmative environments, rather than environments where they're feeling like they have to mask. So energy accounting. So energy accounting is one of these tools that I was talking about that can be really helpful to protect us against burnout. So it's reported as helpful by neurodivergent individuals, but can also be used kind of with neurotypical individuals. And the idea of energy accounting is to track and manage energy levels throughout the day. So it involves identifying activities that kind of drain our energy. We call them withdrawals, but also those activities that kind of replenish our energy, that give us deposits. So here it looks like a battery. I've also seen it done with like money coins in a bank account. But it's just about being really mindful of that balance, so that young people can be kind of managing their daily routines and avoiding burnout. So we've got a resource that we'll send out about this, but I just want to go through it in a bit more detail. And actually the resource comes from the National Autistic Society. So I just wanted to flag that, because if your child doesn't have autism, perhaps that might not be the best resource for them, but there are lots of other resources out there if you kind of Google energy accounting that might feel more acceptable to your own young person. But the one I am sending one with the slides, which is really helpful. So yeah, as I said, it's thinking about your child's energy level as a battery. So throughout the day, there'll be things that drain their battery. So quite often this might be social things. There might be kind of sensory experiences. The environment might be really noisy. It might be things that they feel anxious about. So it could be something like attending a medical appointment. So any of those things that kind of really use up a lot of their energy would be the things that we would put down in that column of things that use up my energy, or sometimes we might call them energy drains. But there'll also be things in your child's day that recharge their energy, that kind of fill them up. So this could be their special interests. It might be spending time with particular people. It might be listening to music. It might be spending time in their kind of specific sensory environment that they love. I remember working with a young person that really liked soft things, and that was how they kind of recharged their battery, was all the soft things they could find, and they just give themselves like a real physical cuddle by themselves, but like just envelop themselves in their soft blankets with their soft socks on, and they like to have their hood over their head. And that was kind of just doing that for half an hour in quiet would be kind of what was their kind of charge their battery at the end of a school day. But this example of a battery just might be quite a helpful way to explain it to your child. And you can often think about kind of batteries on a phone or an iPad or something like that, where you see them kind of physically run down throughout the day, and then we have to charge them up. So yeah, it can be just a really helpful way, visual tool of working through with your child. What are the things that give them energy, and what are the things that drain their energy? And then once you've done that, you make a bit of a plan for the day or for the week that make sure it includes a good balance. So instead of, what we often find is that when we first do this with our young people, the week is full of drains and there's not enough time in there recharging batteries. So how can we recharge batteries? So often it means building things into the day to rebuild that battery so that it's not always going right down to flat. And that's what we know can be really helpful when thinking about masking. Are there certain things that we might be able to take away that that really use up a lot of energy that aren't necessary? Often they will be necessary. So then how do we build in that recharge? We just wanted to have kind of a gentle acknowledgement that this can really apply to yourself as well. It can often feel impossible to take time for ourselves as parents or carers. So we're not going to take lots of time kind of prescribing exercises to try, hobbies to do. But you will know what makes you feel good. And we hope that this is just a bit of a reminder that in the times where there is, even if it's a few minutes, you can do those things that make you feel good. And sometimes it might need to sit down and think about, what are your drains, what are your deposits, and how can you get a bit more of a balance? Is there something that you can do in a few minutes that can help boost your energy, can help kind of fill up your cup a little bit to help you prepare for going into the next thing? And I guess part of this is a reminder that those really basic needs need to be met. Those kind of sleep, food, water, they're all key to this. So whilst it might be really difficult, it might be really helpful to think about where you build those into your day, thinking about exercise and things like that. Exercise, we know, can actually give us an energy boost, even if we're really not feeling ready for it. Actually kind of getting out and maybe going for a walk with your team might actually be a way for you both to kind of get some of that positive moving energy. But this also might be about taking a moment to think about who you've got around you, what support you've got that can actually help fill up, give you some energy deposits. Is there certain people that you spend time with that actually can be quite draining, and other people that actually, when you share your concerns, really help to kind of fill you back up? So yeah, just it might be a really helpful exercise to do for yourself, particularly maybe if you're a neurodiverse parent. It could be something that might be a really helpful tool for you to use yourself. So Emmy touched on the vulnerabilities that you all recognised actually before we got to it in the Slido. But I guess we just wanted to come up with some kind of practical things to support you, because this was something that was really flagged to us with our co-production team, that actually these are a real concern, and that was absolutely echoed in the Slido responses. And I guess, again, the main thing here is conversations. It might feel really uncomfortable or tricky to have some of these conversations, but the best thing we can do is have quite direct conversations and employ some of those communication strategies that we talked at the beginning to talk about this. But there's some really helpful resources. So again, anything that's underlined on here should be a link to a resource, but I'll also, most of these will be sent out with the slides, or you could Google what's on the slide and you should be able to find them. But these are some resources that might help scaffold some of those difficult conversations. The NAS, it's not on this slide actually. I think it might be on the next slide, but there's the National Autistic Society have a Know Yourself series, and that is definitely in our resources. And this has got loads of stuff, loads of little videos, but it's also got a booklet and it covers loads of these different topics, and it's a booklet you can work through with your teen, so you can have some of those conversations as you go. It's also got loads of links to videos of teens talking about their autistic children talking about their experiences as well. So perhaps might come easier from a video from a teen who they might kind of identify with more easily than a parent who they might be feeling at this time where their kind of identity is developing and they're feeling like they want to push back on kind of their family ties and connect more with their peers. Sometimes it can be really helpful to kind of use other teenagers' experiences to support that. So just thinking about money. So Emmy kind of touched on how it might be a time where they've got more access to money. Perhaps they've got a job, perhaps they've got kind of pocket money that's storing up. So teaching money skills is so important. And again, it's just really good to be kind of really explicit about this. In terms of time, I think I'm going to move on because all of these resources will be sent out to you, and they're all brilliant resources. I've looked at them, so they're really great for supporting some of those conversations and for you to hold in mind. Supporting responsibility taking. So we've talked a lot about that kind of drive for independence in adolescence and the idea of your teen needing to kind of develop their own self-identity, as well as the challenges that might pose. So one way of thinking about responsibility with your young person can be to think about negotiable and non-negotiable responsibilities. So what areas of priority are there for you and your teen when it comes to responsibility? So are there certain skills that they want to work towards developing and they might be able to kind of take increasing steps towards that responsibility? Something at the moment that might feel completely out of their limits, but it might be something that they can work towards. And I guess just that recognition that responsibilities might be a bit fluid and changeable. So maybe if your teen's having a harder week where there's a period of time coming up where they're going to be doing something that we know they're going to find harder, you might be thinking about actually what responsibilities can be taken away from them for this short period to ease that overwhelm. So the responsibility tree is one way that you might think about this with your young person and might be a tool to have that conversation. So you can draw out a tree with your young person. There's a free resource that we'll send out when we send out the slides. And you can just think about what things need to go on here, and you can color code them differently to think about how those different responsibilities sit differently. So there might be one color for kind of non-negotiable responsibilities. These are always my child is always responsible for these, and they kind of take that and accept that. And there might be other ones that are a bit more fluid, or it might be thinking about these are responsibilities at school, these are responsibilities at home, these are responsibilities when it comes to kind of managing time with friends. So this is a really good tool that can be used to kind of develop responsibility, but also just have that conversation. Like, what are the things that maybe your child, there might be differences between opinions. And so this can be really helpful to have some of those conversations. So we've got a Slido here that we will have up for a few minutes. But I want to make sure we get to the end. So apologies if you don't all get a chance to put your comments in. But in what ways could you support your child to take more responsibility? I think we thought this would be helpful for parents to share together so that you could kind of get the experiences of other parents. But we are I know we're kind of coming up to time. If not, we've got 1 minute left, but we have got a few more slides to get through, but I will get to them as quickly as I can. Their bedroom. Yeah, start earlier to take longer. So perhaps that's kind of getting up and getting ready, or perhaps that's meaning thinking about responsibility taking as kind of the steps to that might take a little bit longer than expected. Discussing what they feel able to do and cope with. Yeah, definitely. It's got to be a conversation, hasn't it? Rather than us dictating it to them. Encouraging them to do things for themselves. Yeah. And I guess what we've reflected with some other parents is that getting them to see what they're working towards can be a really helpful way of kind of getting them to take some responsibility, allowing them to decide, drawing attention to what's being done for them still. So yeah, so how what's being asked is actually reasonable. Yeah, so highlighting kind of what steps they've got to take to get to where they want to be, using encouragement. Great. Okay, so I guess we also just wanted to think about creating kind of a support around your child, so creating that sense of community. So we've reflected a lot on how it's a time where they kind of want to perhaps move away from the family, develop their own sense of identity, but we also want them to feel held and supported. And sometimes that can be really overwhelming as a parent or carer to be doing that alone. So a strategy, but also a really important thing, is to be able to kind of help them feel held by those around them, so by a team or a community. So I guess it's thinking about where the other people are in your young person's life that can help to support them. So it doesn't mean that no parental input's required, because absolutely that's still the case, but just thinking about how we can perhaps use that community to support bits of their independence or to support bits of responsibility taking, and actually helping them to see that when they ask for advice or when they recognize they've not done something right, that's actually a greater sign of their maturity. So in healthcare, we often think of the triangle of care. So we consider how the individual's at the centre, but that the family and professionals around them can work together in a joined up way to support them. We're particularly thinking about kind of adults in the community that we want to be supporting, I suppose, when we think about that. But it can be really similar in the teen years. So how do we utilise other people in our child's life? It might be an education staff member that they've got a really good relationship with. And how do we get them to support and encourage kind of our young person's development? It might be that they've got a really responsible friend that they know that they can call when they're feeling tempted to engage in risky behaviours that might actually, it feels difficult to speak to their parent about, but this responsible friend might be a good influence. It might be that you can connect them more into kind of groups or clubs that give them opportunities to meet with their kind of like-minded peers and develop those kind of deeper, more meaningful relationships. Or it might be thinking about who's in the extended family. Is there an older cousin or an aunt and an uncle that they feel they can connect with and talk to about some of those challenges in their life? So building that support network around your child can be a really positive experience for them and help them develop their sense of identity, but it can also be really supportive for you. Okay, so we are at the end, and I just wanted to share some messages of hope. So these have come from either our parent representatives, and then we've got some from our those with lived experiences of being a neurodivergent team. So short and sweet, but it definitely gets better. That was a real strong sense that we got from our parents that have been there and done it and really do kind of want to share that message that it is hard, but it gets better. And it's part of their natural rite of passage of being a teenager. So they reflected on kind of how the brain is going through all of these changes, but actually they come out the other side of it where they do have a bit more sense of control of their kind of those executive functioning, and they do want a relationship. And whilst there was that pushback during the teen years, they've come out the other side. And actually they kind of saw it as it was just a phase, it was just part of teenage life. And actually their job as an adult was to kind of work out where they could allow them to become more independent and where they actually had to step in and put those boundaries in. So I just thought that was a really helpful kind of perspective to offer from a parent that's kind of been through that process of the teenage years. So then there's a couple of quotes here from those with lived experiences. So the teenage years are tough, but they can also be a time of discovering your unique strengths if you're given the right space and support. And hopefully some of the strategies or some of the things we've talked about today will help you kind of give that support and space for your young person. And then, I also like this one. Please know that even though it might not always look like it, I'm sure any young person you support love you dearly. Whether they're neurodivergent or not, they're probably going through a very difficult time right now. And the irony is that if they're shutting you out or screaming about how you're the worst person in the world, they're probably terrified inside and need you more than ever. And I guess that just talks to some of that. Don't give up. These can be really difficult times, but actually I think what this young person wanted to get across is that they love you underneath all of the behaviours they might be displaying. They love you and they need you. And hopefully alongside all the other quotes we've given, that's a helpful encouragement. Okay, so how would you rate your current knowledge? I'm not sure why we've got responses here, because I can't imagine that so if people could pop in, if people give their responses, I'm not sure why there's responses here, but there should, any new ones that you add in will be taken into account. So At the beginning, we got to rate your knowledge and your confidence in supporting your team. So again, we're just going back to that knowledge question. So how would you rate your current knowledge of supporting your neurodivergent team? Right, so it looks like kind of the knowledge has gone up, although I will admit that might be quite skewed because there were some responses on there already. And how would you rate your current confidence? I'm hoping, Emmy, there's a way for us to establish new responses and old responses for our kind of
It somehow copied the original where they've responded because those were the scores at the beginning.
Okay, so we'll be able to see that.
So there is a slight shift.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Emmy, for spotting that. Thank you, everybody. Okay, and 2 key things that you found helpful in this workshop. So yeah, just to reiterate what Emmy said at the beginning, this is the first time doing this workshop and it's a really broad kind of area. So, and we absolutely take into account feedback. So anything that you've got that's helpful. If you notice me writing things down, it's because as we were going through, I was making comments on kind of what worked, what maybe felt trickier. So absolutely welcome any feedback. Somebody's found energy accounting and responsibility tree helpful. Great. We will be sending out resources for them with the slides, the lived experience views. Yeah, I'm so grateful to participate. They gave us so much when we were getting this together. People being able to share their own comments. Yes, we love Slido in terms of being able to yeah, there's loads here, but yes, it will absolutely be sent out, so you can go through it. We recognise there's so much information to take in these workshops, so it can be a real challenge. Particularly, I think someone said they've got young children kind of taking their attention away. Absolutely, if you've got feedback,
holidays.
Yeah, it's school holidays. We don't do our mental health series in the summer holidays, but yeah. So yes, if there's that's really helpful. Yes, sorry. Yeah, a break for all parents. I think would probably be helpful.
You know, I was thinking that
time. But yes, so no, definitely that's why we send the slides and the resources so you have got your own time. And the recording goes live. We're live now. The recording goes online too. So you will be able to watch back the recording as well. If you find that more helpful than just seeing the slides alone, the recording will be sent out to you when we send the slides. There'll be a link to the recordings. Yeah, okay. We need to think about how we incorporate breaks because I think that's a really important point. Thank you, everybody. Okay. Have you found today's workshop helpful? If there was anybody that wanted to provide feedback on the last slide but didn't get a chance, there's another opportunity for feedback that you can do in your own time. Particularly if you've got to rush off, we've got another feedback form where you can give more information. Quite a varied response to that. Thank you. So those of you that neither agree nor disagree, we would absolutely love your feedback because it'd be really helpful to know how we can make it more helpful. So one thing that I think would have improved this workshop, so it sounds like a break would definitely have improved the workshop. I also acknowledge that kind of content-wise, we tried to fit in a lot. This is a new one, so it's always tricky to kind of navigate how much you're putting in. And yeah, it's a really broad topic. Yes, we touched on gender identity, but we definitely didn't give it as much time as it was needed because it could be a whole nother workshop in itself, I think. Felt like quite a lot of being talked at. Okay. Maybe changing up speakers was help that feel. Yeah, that might be. Okay, so the suggestions I'll try and think about how any suggestions that were made in terms of strategies that weren't directly on the slides. I'll make sure that when we think about resources that there's as much there as possible so that you're not having to rely on your notes because yes, it was rushed. Yeah, we could divert, yeah, break it up a bit using illustrations and videos rather than us talking. So in terms of self-harming, there is a lot on our that is covered on. We have a specific workshop. Oh, Emmy, is our self-harming workshop part of the mental health series rather than? I think we've got a
I
specific
think
workshop on our
so.
mental health series around self-harming, so that might be helpful. I think we touch on it in our low mood series within the neurodiversity workshops, but we definitely have a whole presentation on it within our mental health series, which might be helpful. Yeah, we've meddled around with timings and found that our evening ones weren't well attended, but we can definitely think about timings again.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
difficult because you sometimes have the sleep time and bedtime routines and other kind of
Yeah,
commitments in the evening. So we found it's made not a lot of difference, I think.
yeah. But completely understand that watching this at work
Mm,
and trying to take it in is also really
really
overwhelming.
difficult.
So this you can give more detailed feedback here. If you haven't had a chance to give feedback, you can give feedback here if you wanted to give some more on the other slides. But thank you so much for all the comments there. That was really helpful and definitely gives us something to think about. These are some of the resources that I talked about. Most of these I'll also be sending out like as attachments to the email as well. But there's links there. This just gives you the rest of our neurodiversity online parent carer workshops. If you've come to this today, hopefully you're aware of the rest of the series, but if you're not, there's lots more that you can attend. And this has the ones that have been in the past, so the recorded versions on YouTube, but also the upcoming ones. Some key resources here if you're kind of worried about your young person at the moment, so more in that kind of period of crisis. There's some resources there. Previous workshops, I think I've talked about them already, and our mental health series of workshops. The Recovery College. So this is open to all of those that are interested in mental health, and they actually have a specific one for kind of later in life, those later teens. So there's a 16 to 25-year-olds kind of discovery college, which helps people kind of think about their identity and their self-care at that specific time in their life. So that could be really helpful for some of those older teens.